Have you ever devoted your entire life to a place, only to be kicked out like a stranger without so much as a thank you? Can you imagine the feeling of betrayal, not by one person, but by an entire system you once trusted completely? They didn't just take away my job. They nearly stole the future I bled and cried to build. And the worst part? I saw it coming, but I couldn't get out of the way in time. My name is Clara Simmons. I am 60 years old, and on a damp Friday afternoon in Kansas City, I officially became excess. I had been with Dawson Systems for 28 years, 11 months, and 28 days. Just 2 more days, and my full retirement package, worth nearly $500,000, would have kicked in, the final reward for nearly 3 decades of steady dedication. I used to imagine that moment like a golden ticket to retirement. I had plans to move closer to my daughter in Oregon, buy a small lakeside cabin, grow tomatoes and live out the rest of my days in peace, but all of that turned to ash in just 12 minutes and 18 seconds on the 9th floor. "Miss Clara, please come in." I had never heard the executive assistant's voice sound so hollow. Every nerve in my body screamed a warning as I stepped into the room. I had never been summoned to the executive office on a Friday afternoon, especially not with him staring fixedly at the light brown envelope on the desk, instead of looking me in the eye. Brent Holloway, the new CEO, 8 months into his role, infamous for his nickname the Streamliner, the man who slashed over 60 positions in his first quarter. I had never worked with him directly, but what I knew was enough to make me wary. "Clara, how long have you worked here again?" His voice was light, like he was asking whether I preferred tea or coffee. 28 years, 11 months, 28 days, I replied without hesitation. I knew that number like the back of my hand. Every day, every night, every long year I gave to this company, I remembered clearly. Brent nodded slightly, then sighed, like he was mourning something, but I knew it was all an act. "Very impressive," he said, then pushed the envelope toward me. "But unfortunately, due to budget restructuring, we are forced to downsize. And your position has been affected. The decision is effective immediately." The room seemed to tilt. I didn't react. I didn't scream. Didn't slam the table. Didn't beg. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "What was the company's profit last quarter, Mr. Holloway?" He flinched slightly but kept a calm facade. "I don't think this is the right time to—" $6.7 million, I cut in. "And you're saying this is about the budget?" He shrugged. "Clara, this decision came from above, my hands are tied, this is the severance package. 3 months' salary, on the condition that you sign the waiver by 5 p.m. tomorrow." I took the envelope but didn't open it. My hands were ice cold. In my mind one number kept repeating. 2 days. Just 2 more days, and the retirement fund I'd waited my whole life for would have been mine. But they weren't going to give me that chance. They knew and they planned for this. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Brent looked up, clearly surprised that I wasn't making a scene. But he had forgotten one thing. I was the one who had uncovered more than 40 internal violations during my 20-plus years as a compliance officer. I could read shady moves by the way someone breathed. And this time, their game was painfully obvious. I left the office like a quiet wind. No tears, no looking back. But inside me, a fire had begun to burn. I didn't yet know what I would do next, but I knew one thing for certain. They picked the wrong person to cast aside. I didn't sign. I didn't open the envelope. Didn't ask questions. Didn't beg for a last chance. I just stood up, smiled just enough to make Brent Holloway shudder, and walked out of that polished, hollow office with the only thing they couldn't take from me. My dignity. By the time I stepped out of Dawson Systems, the rain had started to fall hard. I didn't rush to open my umbrella. That rain felt as cold as the years I had sacrificed for this company. Those nights I stayed at the office until nearly midnight reviewing reports, the holidays cancelled last minute because of surprise audits. The dinners I ate alone under pale fluorescent lights because no one else would look at the numbers. I should have been angry, but all I felt was emptiness. Not because I was fired, but because they thought I would walk away that easily. I had seen this coming months ago. Ever since Brent Holloway took charge and began his organizational restructuring, I knew his type. Clean-cut, charming with a voice like sugar, but hands stained with dirt. He didn't cut jobs to save money, he cut for the numbers on the profit sheet. Every name crossed off was a plus mark on his performance record with the board of directors. I wasn't just the next name, I was an obstacle. Because I knew too much. Because I had been secretly collecting evidence for 4 years. From the first flicker of suspicion to the long months of pretending to be the loyal employee just to survive. I got home just as the rain stopped. My small apartment in the northern suburbs of Kansas City was silent. I brewed a pot of black tea, pulled out the key to a gray filing cabinet pressed against the wall. Behind the row of file clips was a small metal box with 3 locks. I called it my survival box. Inside were copies of altered financial reports, internal emails ordering backdated contracts, memos with falsified data, and an external hard drive containing the full archive of accounting files since the year 2020. I never planned to use any of it, but I kept it, because after more than 2 decades in compliance, my instincts told me one day someone would try to bury me quietly. And that day had finally come. I pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and scrolled down to a name I had never deleted, even though I hadn't used it in 6 years. Logan Barrett. Logan had once been the chief financial officer of Dawson Systems. He left quietly in the year 2017, right after a shady merger I never believed was clean. We had never been close, but Logan had always respected me. One of the few who treated me as a real colleague, not just that cranky audit lady. Now he was working for the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. I made the call. My heartbeat was steady and clear. When he picked up, his voice was deep, just like I remembered. "Clara, is that really you?" "Hi Logan, it's been a while," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation." He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Go on." I gave a brief summary of what happened. The termination, the timing, and Brent's phony excuse. Then I told him about the documents I had. About 4 years of data that could bring down the entire executive tier at Dawson Systems. Not a single interruption, just a heavy silence on the other end. Then Logan asked, "Can you be in DC by Monday?" I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see it. "I'll be there, and I'm bringing everything." Before we hung up, he said something I'll never forget. "You know what, Clara? They picked the wrong person to silence." That night, I didn't sleep. I spent the entire night scanning every document, numbering them, organizing them chronologically. I wrote a detailed summary of the violations, along with annotations for every time I had issued an internal warning. All of which had been ignored or twisted. By dawn I had printed out 3 identical sets of files. One for the SEC, one for my personal attorney, and one in case I needed to protect myself. When the first light of day slipped through the curtains, I stood up, poured a glass of water, and looked at myself in the mirror. I might have looked tired, but in my eyes there was fire. Not the fire of anger, but the fire of a woman who knows she's doing the right thing. And has nothing left to lose. The war had begun. I arrived in Washington, D.C. on Sunday evening, carrying an old silver-gray suitcase packed with documents that could dismantle an entire empire. I booked a small room at a hotel near the SEC headquarters, not for the amenities, but because I wanted to be close to the one place I could still trust. The law. On Monday morning, I wore my dark blue suit, the one I had always saved for special occasions, only this time, it wasn't for a boardroom meeting. It was for the biggest confrontation of my life. I reached the SEC building at 8:43 a.m. The air there held that invisible chill of power and regulation, the kind I had once stood beside, only to be hurt by its silence for many years. Logan Barrett was already waiting in the lobby. He looked older than the last time I saw him, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were just as sharp as ever. Clara, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. Are you ready? Never been more ready, I replied, my voice hard as steel. We walked into a large conference room, soundproofed with glass walls, black leather chairs arranged in a U-shape. 2 others were already there. Eleanor Wu, a senior attorney in the enforcement division, and Patrick Doyle, a veteran financial analyst and investigator. Eleanor didn't waste any words. Miss Simmons, before we begin, I want to confirm, you are voluntarily providing this information and documentation to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, with full understanding of your rights and legal responsibilities, correct? I nodded. Completely voluntary, and I'm here because the truth deserves to be heard. The hearing began. I opened the first binder and pulled out the summary of violations. Manipulated revenue timing, legitimized suspicious expenses, falsified product quality certifications, and collusion with a subsidiary to inflate stock value. Patrick frowned immediately as he flipped through the first few pages. This number? It's fake? I nodded, pointing to a line in the notes. This is the Q4 report for the year 2022. Reported revenue rose 22%, but in reality, 38% of it came from orders that were either cancelled or never paid. They pulled figures from the following quarter, even from the next year. Eleanor interjected, her voice cold and precise. Do you have proof that senior executives were aware of this? I opened a folder of printed emails, marked with a red paperclip. Pages 5 through 12. Mr. Brent Holloway directly instructed the accounting department to backdate contracts to validate the report. In one email he even states, "We need to make these numbers shine. Don't let the board see any shortfall." Patrick scanned a few lines, then looked up. Eyes wide. Good Lord! This isn't just internal misconduct, this is systemic fraud. I nodded, feeling like someone was finally seeing the full picture I'd spent 4 years building on my own. Over the next 3 hours, I walked them through 7 major financial manipulations, detailing each time I issued internal warnings and was ignored. I also presented evidence of tampered quality certifications, where Brent approved a batch of untested products just to meet a shipping deadline, regardless of customer risk or consumer safety. Eleanor sat still for a moment, tapping her fingers lightly on the table. I've worked at the SEC for 18 years. I've never seen a fraud system this smooth, this reckless, wrapped so neatly under the guise of restructuring. Patrick turned to me. Do you have evidence this impacted the stock price? I pulled out a chart. This is internal data used in investment presentations, fabricated growth figures. From June to September last year, stock value rose nearly 40% due to falsified financials. And here's a message between the current CFO and Brent. They knew exactly what they were doing. Logan nodded in confirmation. I verified some of those numbers back when I was still at Dawson. They didn't match the actual data at all. Eleanor slid the documents back toward me. Ms. Simmons, under SEC Rule 20.f, you qualify for protection as a whistleblower. We will initiate a formal investigation immediately, starting with seizing Dawson Systems data servers. Patrick looked at me intently. And I have to be honest, if what you've given us continues to check out, we're not just talking about an unfair dismissal, we're looking at a securities fraud case that could send people to prison. I paused for a beat, then said, I didn't come here for revenge. I came here for justice. Because no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to bury the truth without facing the consequences. The meeting ended just before noon. As I stepped out of the room, my feet felt steadier than they ever had. Before, I had thought I was just another discarded employee. But, now, I realized I was the last one brave enough to shine a light on the darkness they tried to bury. And the first light had just begun to break through. I had only been back in Kansas City for 1 day when the phone started ringing like an alarm siren, not just one call, but non-stop. From early morning until late evening. As if all of Dawson Systems had lost control. The first name to appear was Linda Hayward, head of human resources, the woman who had been avoiding me for years, as if I were a living reminder of the ethics they didn't want to face. I didn't answer. Her voicemail came after 3 beeps. Clara, I hope you're carefully considering the severance offer. There's still time to resolve this quietly. Not an apology, not a single sign of remorse, just fear. And I knew why. 3 hours later, it was Brent Holloway's turn. I listened to his voice, rushed and cornered, on the recording. Clara, we understand there may have been a misunderstanding. Let's talk like former colleagues. I can come by if that's easier for you. But please, don't let this go too far. Go too far? I almost laughed. They wanted me to bury the truth to preserve their clean image? And now that the truth was clawing its way out of the mud, they said I was taking things too far? I stayed silent. And that silence was what drove them mad. That evening I was making tea when the doorbell rang. Through the small window beside the door, I saw a black sedan parked out front. And the man on the doorstep? None other than Brent Holloway. I stood behind the door, still holding the warm teacup, listening to him call out. Clara, it's me, Brent. I didn't come to argue, I just want to return some documents, a chance to end this peacefully. I didn't answer. Didn't open the door. Didn't react. I just stood there, letting him feel the chill of the truth tightening around the collar of his tailored suit. After nearly 5 minutes of mixing soft words with veiled threats, he left a thick envelope in my mailbox and drove off. I waited until his car was completely out of sight before stepping out. Inside the envelope was a new non-disclosure agreement. Still offering 3 months' salary, but now with an added clause. No further disclosure of any documents to third parties. I folded the paper and tossed it into the kitchen drawer without reading the rest. At that moment, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Rumors of the SEC investigation have leaked. Emergency meeting tonight at headquarters. They're panicking. I wasn't surprised. By the next morning, an email from Dawson Systems legal department appeared in my personal inbox. The subject line was in all caps. Termination decision suspended, request to maintain employment status. Section 47. The content was filled with vague phrases like, under review, internal reassessment, and consideration of legality. But I knew all too well. This wasn't goodwill. It was a strategic retreat. They were trying to freeze the situation, hoping to turn the tide. That afternoon I received a video call from Elizabeth, my daughter. She lives in Portland, Oregon. Far removed from the chaos I was facing. But today her voice carried a strain of frustration. Mom, I just read an article. It says, you're trying to sue the company for personal reasons. They're painting you as vengeful. I pressed my lips together, keeping my voice steady. They can write whatever they want, Elle, but the truth is still the truth. And I'm ready to show the world exactly that. There was a pause, then she said softly, I'm proud of you, Mom. After the call, I opened my laptop and checked the news. Just as Elizabeth said, some financial news sites were beginning to shift the narrative. Quoting anonymous, internal sources, suggesting I was bitter about not getting promoted, and distorting facts for personal gain. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The company had entered the media counterattack phase. They knew they couldn't stop the investigation, so now they were targeting my reputation. A cowardly move. But not a surprising one. And I no longer had time for fear. I opened the safe and pulled out a set of documents I hadn't submitted yet. Old emails from the previous CEO. Cryptic discussions about how to polish reports before shareholder meetings. Proof that the fraud scheme began long before Brent Holloway came on the scene. If they wanted to fight me with rumors, I would fight back with truth they couldn't deny. 3 days after I declined the non-disclosure agreement for the 3rd time, an official email from Dawson Systems was sent to my attorney. The subject line was simple. Invitation to emergency meeting with executive leadership. There was no apology, no acceptance of responsibility, just a cold, mandatory invitation, a final attempt to extinguish the flame they had lit themselves. But this time, I wasn't going alone. I arrived with my personal attorney, Miranda Ellis, a woman with more than 30 years of corporate legal experience, eyes sharp as a scalpel and a voice that could slice through any excuse. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we stepped into the conference room on the 16th floor. The same floor where, not long ago, I had been cast out like surplus. The glass doors clicked shut behind me with a dry snap, marking the start of a battle they no longer had control over. Seated at the long table were 3 board members, the company's legal counsel, and Brent Holloway, his face noticeably paler than the last time I had seen him. Charles Brenner, the chairman of the board, spoke first, his voice weak like he hadn't slept in days. "Ms. Simmons, thank you for coming. First, I want to express that we deeply regret the recent events. There may have been a misunderstanding in how the situation was handled." I tilted my head slightly, my lips curving into a cold smile. "The misunderstanding you speak of nearly robbed me of the retirement benefits I spent my entire life building." Brent sat motionless, eyes flicking toward me before quickly dropping to the folder in front of him. "People who've been exposed often do that." Miranda clasped her hands, leaning slightly forward. "Before we continue, my client needs confirmation. Has the termination of Ms. Clara Simmons been officially rescinded?" The company's legal counsel, a man in his 50s named Dean Morris, gave a stiff nod. "Yes. Ms. Simmons is now considered an employee with full reinstatement of all benefits, including salary, insurance, and, most importantly, her full, seniority-based retirement package." I said nothing. I simply opened my briefcase, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the table. The sharp thud it made seemed to freeze the entire room. "What I've brought here is not for negotiation," I said slowly. "I'm not interested in a promise of goodwill, nor in a, 'we apologize for the inconvenience' letter. I'm here to make one thing clear. Every document I possess, and have submitted to the SEC, will be disclosed, accurately, completely, and without concealment." Dean cleared his throat, attempting to remain calm. "Ms. Simmons, perhaps we should consider a settlement approach. The company is prepared to—" Miranda raised her hand to cut him off. "No settlement will be discussed until the federal investigation is concluded." I looked directly at Charles Brenner, the same man who never once acknowledged me in the hallway, and enunciated each word. "I will speak the truth. Whether that saves or destroys Dawson Systems depends entirely on what you choose to do from this point forward." No one replied. They knew exactly what I had in my hands. After a tense silence, Charles took a deep breath and tried to shift his tone. "We genuinely value your professional integrity. Given your experience, Dawson would like to invite you back, but this time in a new role: Corporate Ethics Reform Advisor." I raised an eyebrow and responded slowly. "Reform?" After trying to silence me with hush money and pushing me out like a pawn past her turn. Brent finally spoke, his voice small and shaky. "Clara, I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at him coldly. "You didn't think, because you never imagined anyone would dare to stand up to you." Miranda continued, her tone still razor-sharp. "If my client is to consider any role at this company, all terms must be written clearly in a binding agreement, along with a legal commitment from the board that every past misconduct will be subject to an independent investigation. No one receives immunity." The room sank into suffocating silence. No one objected, because they knew they no longer had the power to bargain. We left the meeting just before noon. On the way to the parking lot, Miranda glanced at me and gave a small nod. "You made that entire room afraid to breathe." I smiled, but deep down I didn't feel relief, because I knew this was only the beginning. The truth is a sharp blade. It doesn't just cut the chains that bound me. It slices through the false moral facade Dawson Systems used to hide the rot within. And I was going to see it through to the end. 3 days after the meeting with the executive board, I woke up to a quiet morning and noticed my phone flashing non-stop like it was on fire. messages, missed calls, emails. From old friends, former colleagues, even names I didn't recognize. But when I opened the homepage of a major financial news site, I immediately understood what had just erupted. Clara Simmons, whistleblower who exposed financial scandal at Dawson Systems, the headline scrolled across the screen. Just below was a photo of me from my time at the company. My face, serious under the pale glow of the old office lights. And then other news outlets followed suit. A 60-year-old woman with nearly 30 years of experience bravely comes forward to expose fraud at one of the Midwest's largest tech corporations. Dawson Systems faces federal investigation after veteran employee provides hundreds of pages of evidence. I sat still in front of the screen, not out of fear, but because the truth had finally broken through the invisible walls they once built to cage it. But just one day later, I realized Dawson would not go down quietly. It started with a leaked internal perspective article from a small publication. Brent Holloway appeared, his tone so sincere it made me sick. "We've always aimed for transparency. It's unfortunate that certain individuals, perhaps driven by personal disappointment or motives, have chosen to misrepresent data in ways that harm the..." He didn't mention my name, but everyone knew who he meant. The next day he gave a televised interview on a local news channel, wearing a navy blue suit and a smile as weak as day-old coffee. Perhaps Miss Simmons felt left behind after the restructuring. "We can't rule out the possibility that this is an emotional response, lacking objectivity." He wanted to turn me into a bitter old woman. An employee hurt by being let go. A woman who couldn't accept being left behind. But he forgot the most important thing. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. On Monday morning, the SEC held a short press conference at their Kansas City field office. Their spokesperson declared, "We confirm that Ms. Clara Simmons is a federally protected whistleblower. All documents provided by her are under serious investigation. There is no indication that her actions were driven by personal motives." Immediately after, they released an official statement to major media outlets, demanding an end to the spread of unverified information and warning of legal consequences should further attempts to discredit the whistleblower continue. For the first time in days I exhaled, but I knew the real battlefield still lay ahead. That night, I opened the safe in my home. Inside was a set of documents I had never shared, not with the SEC, not with my attorney, not with anyone. It was evidence of misconduct dating back to the year 2015, when Dawson Systems' previous CEO, Harold Gilman, was still in charge. I had once discovered inflated expense reports used to create off-the-books travel funds. There were also emails between Harold and one of the current board members, discussing temporarily moving data to a subsidiary to avoid surprise audits. Back then, I kept it only out of unease. Now, it had become the weapon that would destroy their final line of defense. The excuse that all wrongdoing began with Brent Holloway. The next morning, I reached out directly to Eleanor Wu, the lead attorney on the SEC's investigative team. "I have additional documents, but this time, they go beyond Holloway. They show that the entire fraud model began under Gilman." I sent over the copies that same day. Just 2 hours later, Eleanor called back, her voice nearly trembling with intensity. "Clara, this is the death blow. It proves the board has been silent for years. At least 3 of them knew, and still signed off on the financial reports." "They didn't just do wrong," I replied. "They conspired." 3 days later, the SEC expanded its investigation. 4 additional board members were summoned. The media erupted. Several major shareholders began dumping stock, causing Dawson Systems' share value to plunge more than 27% in just 48 hours. The press no longer called me a disgruntled whistleblower. They now referred to me as the woman who exposed nearly a decade of corporate fraud. When my daughter called, her voice was proud and emotional. "Mom, do you know? You're not just my mom anymore. You're a role model for an entire generation." I smiled, my voice low. I don't need to be a role model for anyone. I just refuse to bow to liars." 10 days after the SEC officially expanded its investigation, Dawson Systems' entire executive leadership began collapsing like a glass tower cracking at its foundation. The news spread fast. No need to wait for the press. Inside the company it felt like an earthquake. 4 board members resigned on the same morning. No statements, no farewell handshakes. They vanished from the internal system, from the company's website, and from the power seats they had occupied for more than a decade. A few hours later, David Langston was officially terminated for severe ethical violations, along with a statement that the company would fully cooperate with investigative authorities. I sat in front of the live news broadcast, watching him walk out of the building with a pale, sunken face. Nothing left of the CEO who once tossed me out like worthless garbage. But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, I received a call from Miranda, my attorney. "Clara, big news, the U.S. Attorney's Office has filed criminal charges against Langston." "What charges?" I asked, though I had a strong guess. "Securities fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and abuse of power to manipulate financial reports for personal gain. He's facing up to 20 years in prison if convicted." I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt something like balance being restored. Late, but finally, justice had spoken. 2 days after that, I was invited to the temporary headquarters of Dawson Systems for a private meeting. It was led by Patricia Lyle, the interim CEO. A woman who had served as COO for 8 years and had always kept her distance from shady decisions. The new office was empty. No fake honor plaques, no posters about core values they never followed. Patricia stood when I walked in and offered her hand. "Thank you for coming, Clara. I'll be brief. We owe you. For the truth. For integrity. And for something this company had long lost. Professional ethics." I didn't speak. I simply looked her in the eye, not seeking remorse, but searching for whether Patricia truly understood the damage her system had caused. She placed a thick folder in front of me and flipped to the first page. "We are officially restoring all your benefits, including full retirement, along with a compensation package equal to 5 years of salary. In addition, the company will cover lifetime health insurance for you and your dependents. This is a decision from the new board." I nodded. Miranda reviewed the documents carefully and found no flaws. Patricia continued. "Furthermore, I'm authorized to extend a formal invitation. We hope you'll accept the role of Senior Ethics Advisor, helping us redesign the compliance and ethics oversight system for the entire corporation." I sat silent for a few seconds, letting the quiet speak for me. Finally, I shook my head. I don't want to return to a place that once used power to silence the truth. Patricia was momentarily stunned, but quickly regained her composure. I continued. "I went from being tossed out like trash to being smeared, to being invited back as if nothing ever happened. But I don't need a title to feel worthy. I just need to know that the truth won." Miranda nodded in quiet agreement. I stood up and picked up the compensation agreement, not to return, but to close the chapter. 3 weeks later, I was at the Midwest Regional SEC office, signing an agreement to help build a national whistleblower protection program. Eleanor Wu shook my hand firmly. "We want to tap into your real-world experience. No one understands what it feels like to be turned on by an entire organization better than you." I smiled, feeling truly light for the first time. If I can help someone else avoid the fear I once lived through, then I still have work to do. From that point on, I began working with the SEC as an advisor. No grand title, no corner office, no flashy perks, just me. Clara Simmons, a 60-year-old woman who had once nearly been buried in silence. Now a voice for those pushed aside simply for speaking the truth. I didn't choose this path to become famous. I chose it because I could no longer turn my back on myself. And if I had to start over at this age, I would begin with integrity. I don't need to be anyone's role model, I just refuse to bow to deception. 6 months after David Langston was convicted, I received a letter from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. The envelope was thick, sealed with an official stamp, and inside was a notification regarding the Whistleblower Award. I was granted 15% of the total civil penalties Dawson Systems was ordered to pay, a figure amounting to nearly $2.4 million. When Miranda read the amount aloud from the letter, she paused for a few seconds, her eyes silently asking, "What will you do with it all, Clara?" I just smiled softly. "I know I'm not spending it on a lakeside mansion or a new car." I had thought about this for a long time. During sleepless nights, when the question, "Why me?" clung to my mind, I remembered Thomas, my husband. The man who always believed in integrity, in standing for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. Thomas passed away 11 years ago from cancer. He had been a professor of business ethics at the University of Missouri, and he always told me, "Clara, integrity is the one thing you can't borrow. Either you have it, or you don't." I never forgot those words. And so, I used most of that money to establish the Thomas Simmons Scholarship Fund, dedicated to female students studying corporate ethics and compliance. Part of the fund goes toward tuition assistance, and the rest supports practical training programs on whistleblowing and defending workplace ethics. On the fund's launch day, I stood at the podium in the auditorium of the University of Missouri, looking out at rows of students, mostly young faces, eyes filled with ideals and curiosity. I began with a line that wasn't in my notes. "If anyone tells you that integrity is a weakness, remember my story." A 60-year-old woman, nearly left with nothing after almost 3 decades of work, but in the end, the one still standing when the curtain of lies was pulled back. The room fell silent. I told them about Dawson Systems, not as a tragedy, but as a hard-earned lesson. I told them about the nights I sat alone at my desk, knowing I was facing a system that didn't want to change. I told them about the betrayal, and then the resolve not to let that betrayal happen to anyone else. They listened, took notes, and a few shed tears. And when I ended with, "Integrity is not the price you pay, it is the asset you protect," the entire hall rose to a standing ovation. And Dawson Systems? They didn't collapse completely as many expected. After fines, prosecutions, and a complete overhaul, they still exist, but as a very different company. A new executive team was installed, reporting procedures are now overseen by an independent third party, and quarterly ethics and compliance trainings are mandatory for all employees. What surprised me most was this. One of the key case studies in that training is my story. I know because one day, a new employee at Dawson, a young woman named Marissa, sent me an email. "I just wanted to say, today was the first time I heard about you in orientation training. I couldn't believe a company that once tried to destroy you now teaches your story as an example. But I feel proud knowing you still chose to do what's right, even when no one stood with you. Thank you for not staying silent." I read that email 3 times. For a moment I thought of the Clara from 2 years ago. The woman who sat quietly at her desk, asked to sign a worthless settlement, with her entire future only 3 days away. I thought of the long nights of worry, of the loneliness, when everyone turned their back. Then I thought of this moment. When I no longer had to stay silent. When my story became a tool to awaken the next generation. And I knew I had won, not with power, but with resilience. Now, every week, I work out of a small SEC office on the University of Missouri campus, helping build new whistleblower protection policies. We design training programs, write practical guides, and listen to those being pushed into the shadows. Just like I once was. I don't need a title. I don't need a position. All I need to know is that my story is saving others from the fear of being forgotten, retaliated against, or silenced. And if someone asks me what remains after everything, I'll answer, a life unbowed, and a legacy no one can erase. Clara Simmons' story is a powerful reminder that integrity is not just a moral choice, it is true strength in a world built on deception. Fired just days before earning her retirement, she refused to stay silent and stood her ground with courage and undeniable evidence. In doing so, she not only restored her personal honor but also brought about systemic change. In real life, Clara reminds us, when you stand for the truth, you are never truly alone. What do you think about Clara's choice and her journey to justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to follow the channel for more real-life stories about family, integrity and courage.